Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Democracy in the Balance, the Promise and Perils of Social Media. This program is sponsored by the Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law's David F. and Constance B. Girard-diCarlo Center for Ethics, Integrity, and Compliance. My name is Steve Chanenson. I'm a professor at Villanova Law and the faculty director of the Girard-diCarlo Center. We have an all-star panel here today and not much time, so I'm going to introduce them very briefly and encourage you to learn more about our group through the links on the registration page. We start with Susan Benesch, the Executive Director of the Dangerous Speech Project and Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. She also serves tech companies as an unpaid external source of ideas and critique and speaks on and publishes about governance of online content, hate speech, and disinformation. Then we have Brett Frischmann, the Charles Widger Endowed University Professor of Law, Business, and Economics at Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law. He's an affiliated scholar of the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School and a trustee of the Nexus Center for Internet and Society. Alberto Ibargüen is the president and CEO of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. He's also the former publisher of the Miami Herald and El Nuevo Herald. During his tenure, the Miami Herald won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and El Nuevo Herald won Spain's Ortega y Gasset Prize for Excellence in Journalism. And last but most certainly not least, we have Kate Klonick, an assistant professor of law at St. John's University School of Law. Most recently, she's been studying and writing about private internet platforms and how they govern online speech. And this includes a very widely read February 2021 article in The New Yorker entitled Inside the Making of Facebook Supreme Court. I'm hoping that we're going to have a conversation over the next hour, and while I'll ask some questions to prod us along, I'm looking forward to an exchange from our panelists. The Q&A function is available for those of you who'd like to ask questions, and I'll keep an eye on that as well. Alberto, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Consistent with some of the views of Thomas Jefferson, you once wrote that a well-informed community can best determine its own true interests and is essential to a well-functioning representative democracy. As we think about democracy and social media, what lessons can we learn from the historic role of newspapers?
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. That actually is more, in my mind, is more from Jack Knight than Thomas Jefferson, and Jack Knight, after all, did start Knight Foundation. So I pay a lot of attention to what he wrote and thought. The role of newspapers especially in the second half of the 20th century, and I'd emphasize news rather than paper, because my view is not that we should try to revive an industry that perhaps that has definitely seen better days, but that the role in society was to feed the middle. It provided day in and day out news and information about the way we lived. Everybody talks nostalgically or enthusiastically only about investigative journalism, but the day in, day out definition of what the community was gave people verifiable, personally verifiable often, information that they could build trust on, that they could figure out who the new neighbors are, what our common problems are, what our common opportunities are. There was a value to that that one-to-many kind of publication and the famous agenda setter for the water cooler. There were huge disadvantages, obviously. Power corrupts, and editors and reporters were human and incredibly powerful. If you were from an outsider group, not in the newsroom, women, minorities, you were not likely to see your perspective reflected in the papers until the very later part of the 20th century, right around the time that the business model began to be really stressed by this new thing called internet that allowed the many to many, had speed, had reach, and it informed the citizens, but mainly, I would argue, with less than the same rigor of good verification journalism. Most of all, though, I think what's changed is that the work of informing the base of democracy isn't being done. Democracy is still geographically bound. We still elect mayors and congresspeople and senator on the basis of geography. And we used to, until at the beginning of this century, we used to regularly inform on a basis, whether it was a newspaper or a radio signal, that was roughly the size of a couple of congressional districts, or in the case of a mayor, a city itself. That's the base of democracy for us. It's geographic. And for the first time in the history of the Republic, we've untethered the way we inform from the way we actually practice democracy. At the local level, I think that is hugely dangerous. And I'm always reminded of something that the fellow who wrote The Wire said one time in a congressional testimony when asked by then Senator Kerry how he would sum things up. And he said, Senator, at this point, given the demise of local news, this is a great time to be a crook in local government. You don't know what you don't know. That work is not being done. So I think there's been a major shift from the way we have traditionally informed ourselves at the base to more of an opinion-based, less rigorous, but more small d democratic. What that has led to, we're about to release a night Gallup poll showing that 89% of Americans believe social media makes it easier or much easier to spread disinformation. 61% believe fake news is a more serious problem than the risk of censorship online. And lest anyone believe that we'll suddenly shift away from social media because of the problems, 59% say social media makes it easier or much easier to find information you need, and 74% say it's easier to connect with family and friends. With that kind of personal, intimate benefits, I think that's the equivalent of a tidal wave in favor of keeping it. So we can only really seriously consider modification, not closure or turning back. There's no point in doing that. And that leads us to panels like this one.
So focusing on both the broad geographic reach and the concern about misinformation, right? 89% of people are concerned about it. Kate, last month, former Facebook employee Frances Haugen, now also referred to as the Facebook whistleblower, provided a trove of documents to the Wall Street Journal, later spoke to 60 Minutes and testified before Congress about exactly some of the things Alberto just mentioned, the concern of Facebook's role in amplifying misinformation, toxicity, violent conduct. What was really new in what she revealed, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that there wasn't much new, actually. I think that one of the things that you'll hear from a lot of people who have researched this for a long time is that this was not a particular, and this is pretty typical of leaks or whistleblowers, is that there isn't something that we don't know. It's more the fact that the leak occurs that becomes kind of a rallying point for people and for society to kind of galvanize around, to push for reform or to become aware of kind of these issues. So there wasn't a ton new. And I honestly think that some of the response over-rotated on some of the things that weren't new at like the expense of some of the things that we really have long been trying to drag into the spotlight for, in particular, kind of the attention that certain types of content moderation and censorship focuses doesn't have in other parts of the world outside of the US and things like that. But I just generally think that what we saw with the Facebook whistleblower is a moment in which we have had only 3 years since Cambridge Analytica. which is hard to believe because it feels like so much time has passed. But it's only been 3 years. And I think that to the extent that what Alberto just said is completely correct, we're in this period in which people are very unhappy. I personally don't know how much like self-reporting of blaming of social media and everything else gets us much farther, because also, as Alberto said, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't kind of turn this thing off. You just have to start moving forward. So like, yes, it's good to know that people are very upset and that they lay the blame at the feet of social media. There is undoubtedly an element in which the scale and the frictionless nature of this communication has completely changed how we connect and how we interact with each other. But I just don't think it stops there. And I also don't think that that just because people easily blame social media, that's actually where necessarily the companies is where the solution lies. So much as trying to broker kind of a thoughtful understanding between actual democratic governments and what are still very large and very powerful corporations. So there has to be kind of a dynamic of working with those things together. And I think a sophistication unfortunately, a sophistication that is very hard for people to grasp right now, given how much fake news is out there and how much stuff is going around that is like slightly misleading and how much outrage is out there. But a sophistication about what social media is, what online speech is, what governance, how these companies work, how they govern their rights, and then how those things are even possibly controlled or restrained or modified by regulation.
So I want to get to the topic of how we respond. But before we do, I want to talk just a little bit more about the problem, which at a certain level seems obvious, but I think it's not as clear as it might be. And Susan, people like you have been doing a great job in trying to articulate what some of that harm is. In fact, you created an entire organization about dangerous speech. What is dangerous speech, and how is it different than what we often hear about called hate speech?
I want to echo the others in saying, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to take part among these, as you said, rock star fellow panelists. Dangerous speech is a term that I coined a decade ago for human communication of any kind. It can be words or a photograph, or even in some cases, a t-shirt of a particular color, that lower normal human barriers against violence, against intergroup violence. So it's content that tends to make people condone or even commit violence against members of another human group. That's quite different from hate speech, which is clearly a much broader category. Hate speech is also sadly lacking a clear consensus definition. In practice, hate speech is often whatever is distressing and offensive to a particular person, and almost always differs from one person to another. It isn't defined at all in most bodies of law. Some of the social media platforms have begun to try to define it and to use it as a category, but it's still pretty squishy. Dangerous speech and hate speech overlap, of course, since some speech is dangerous but not hateful. That's a very important point. Getting people to condone violence has a lot more to do with fear than with hatred. There's also an awful lot of hate speech that fortunately doesn't have the capacity to incite people to violence. Even taken together, they are still a small part of what would be an unpleasant but very important map of all of the harmful content online. There are, after all, so many different ways in which people can damage one another. And looking for the solution to bad content online, the solution to hate speech, is like asking for the cure for cancer. That certainly has been in the public discourse mostly in the past, since by now most of us understand that there isn't just one cancer, there are many that affect human bodies, and in fact affect different human bodies in different ways. So if you really want to make progress on cancers, you must rigorously test a variety of different interventions to determine which are going to be most successful in which particular circumstances. And the problem of let's just call it for a simple a simple term, bad content. Bad content is not one problem, but many. And there is, unfortunately, well, let me say the good side of this is that the fact that so much human communication now takes place online is a gigantic opportunity. There are, at least in theory, such tremendous opportunities to study which content actually leads to what kinds of harm, how bad content circulates and why, and how one can best interfere with that without causing other harms like impinging on freedom of expression. That is a gigantic opportunity that we have not previously had in human history. For the moment, however, it's very difficult to do all of that because the companies sit on mountains of data, our data, and are not very good about making it accessible for serious research.
So that's a great segue back into now what to do. And this is a question that I'd like to bring Brett into the conversation, but also the rest of you. Are private platforms or the government better suited to address the problems of social media in our democracy?
Oh, let me unmute. There we go. Thanks everybody for participating in this panel. It's been great, and Steve, thanks for moderating and such good, great questions on such a hot topic. And so your question, before I answer your question or get into your question, I just want to second. So Susan, you put it so nicely to highlight that the varieties of harms from different kind of content, it's like the same as the varieties of bad content are like the varieties of bad behaviors, right? You might think about it similarly, right? So there's just as many bad behaviors as there are different kinds of bad content. There's no single panacea like problem. A panacea like solution to address the problem, because the problem is the problem that we're struggling with is really a complex systems problem that's global in scale, that to solve it requires a set of different kinds of interventions and solutions at the macro global scale, at the meso level of nation states, and certain platforms that span nation states. And then at the micro level of individual behavior in specific contexts. And so if you're thinking about blaming social media companies in particular for the problems that we're facing, kind of misses the boat. There's certainly, it's like blaming climate change on big oil or big coal. And while it's true that big oil and big coal are responsible for much of our climate change problem, not wholly responsible. Dealing with climate change requires that you think about a variety, even what each of us do every day as individuals at the micro level, lots of individual decisions we make. And that same is true when we think about the problems of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, harmful and hateful speech online. It's partly accelerated, accentuated, exacerbated by the platforms and how they're designed, and how they in some ways moderate effectively, in other ways don't moderate content effectively. But it also has something to do with the individuals and how they participate. So I just think it's a complex problem. So that to get to your question, Steve, the answer to is it better solving this problem better suited for private platforms or private industry or government? The answer is yes, both. It's a it's the binary choice is wrong. And by the way, you're missing a third possible set of solutions, which have to do with community-based solutions and social systems that don't rely on either the government or the market to solve those problems. And there's a whole series of, there's a huge literature on commons or community-based institutions for solving knowledge problems. It's actually another part of my research agenda, which I didn't think I was going to talk about today, but you set me up so nicely. And now I guess I'll mention it. But it turns out like solving speech and content problems are, to connect speech and the vast amount of content we see online to the kinds of problems we see that face democracy. It's about translating information and data and speech into intelligence and knowledge among members of a community who are casting votes and participating in social systems together. And that will require platforms, private platforms, as Kate was suggesting, in cooperation with governments who are thinking thoughtfully about diagnosing the problems and thinking about different ways to intervene, but also with communities that form on their own, whether it's, you can think of them as clubs, you can think of things like Wikipedia, you can think about other kinds of institutions that play an important role in sort of combating these problems. So I'll just start it out there. I'm happy to sort of dig in more into solutions along with the other panelists.
Absolutely. Kate, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, so this is, it's never a popular thing to say, because right now we are definitely, and have been for the last 4 to 5 years, really a moment of techlash. But this is not just like the platform's fault. They are certainly making it, they are certainly have changed the entire medium. They are certainly driven by a market-based culture. But as Brent said, there is a complete I think that there is like one of the things that people don't realize about things like the algorithm is that it is built on your behavior. If you go to, to use the example of papers or old news, if you were in an aisle in a shopping mall and you're at a newsstand and you buy more National Enquirers and People magazines and Teen Bop, Tiger Beat, and like whatever else, then like they're going to stock more Tiger Beat and Teen Bop and like whatever else at your local newsstand. Like this is not rocket science, and it's not some nefarious thing that the newsstand is plotting necessarily against you. Like sure, at scale, they make trade-offs that we don't like, and they're not great at responding to them, and we're getting better at trying to give them those signals. But to complicate this, like it's all just surveillance capitalism or it's all just targeted ads, is I think I'm just kind of sick of the talking point, frankly. It's just, I think that it's really starting to, at this point, kind of harm our ability to get to some of the real things that are different here and that we can make a difference and have an intervention on. And the other part of this is, frankly, when we're talking, as Brett just said, about the interaction between government and these private companies and the market, there's something also to remember about government and the skepticism we also hold for government, which is that both sides of the aisle right now are, making hay while the sun shines and can reach out and pick up everything on the techlash. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or you're Democrat, you score points with your constituency, clipping videos of yourself on C-SPAN and sharing them on social media of you yelling at Mark Zuckerberg. So there's a reason like that there also hasn't been change. I think it's one, we don't really have great ways. 2, we're confined by the Constitution. And 3, when I say we don't have great change, I should just say, I want to be specific. We haven't been able to really consolidate around what should necessarily happen. And 2, like there's not even Congress doesn't have very strong motivations right now to actually make change, because the minute they solve some of these problems of big tech, they don't have big tech to kind of kick around anymore. So like, I just kind of want to follow through on some of like the platitudes that have been happening and like kind of understand how this is all a system that is informing each other and no one place is the solution.
So what I love about this panel is you're anticipating questions, not only mine, but from the audience. And one of the questions that we got was, how do the panelists contend with the sensationalism that's taken hold of our national discourse and the role that individuals play and the role of social media in some ways incentivizing that? And I think both Brett and Kate spoke to this by acknowledging very forthrightly that to paraphrase the poet Pogo, we have met the enemy and it is us. That in so many ways, these platforms are a mirror, but maybe we could think of it as a bit of a funhouse mirror. So we're sending it these images. It's not making it any better. But by themselves, these platforms aren't causing the problem. But if we were to look to the platforms for a solution, I'm not sure what we would find. So, Susan, a week or two ago, you were quoted in a Bloomberg article about some of the Twitter changes that they've tried to make recently, and your comment, and I'll read it in a second, really struck me because it talked about the kind of data quantity that these platforms have. You said, we don't know whether these are just tweaks that mainly produce some good PR for Twitter, or if they might be fundamentally shifting things in the right direction. Only Twitter can really find that out. Is this information asymmetry a big piece of the problem, and thus perhaps a piece of the solution?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at before when I said that the platforms control so much data that is a potential gold mine of information on how to improve human behavior without causing other harms. I have got a pretty long view on this since I doubt that Alberto knows this, but I was a staff writer, a reporter at the Miami Herald years ago. And of course, famously in journalism, there is that term, if it bleeds, it leads. The idea that people who are disseminating information prioritize sensationalist information is an old one. The excuse that we journalists used to give if we did it or were accused of doing that. Well, there were various excuses, but the one I'm referring to was, we do this because that's what people want, right? And that's what Kate was also referring to. But then it seems to me requires us to ask, why do people want certain things? It's not because they're born that way. It's not because, for example, hating another group of people is hardwired or somehow inherent to human beings. No baby has ever been born hating or wanting to read sensationalist news stories. If you think about the major improvements in human life over the last century or two, and how they came about, it's worth noticing that many of those problems have been big collective social problems, which is also a way in which we could easily understand the circulation of harmful content online. And they have been improved very significantly in lots of cases because large numbers of people made very small changes in their behavior. Or to put it differently, somebody else convinced very large numbers of people to make small changes in their behavior. Examples, smoking, drunk driving, boiling water before you mix it with formula and feed it to a baby. Birth control, if you, depending on your opinion. But in any case, what I want you to see is that human behavior and even human preferences are not at all fixed. Humans are enormously influenced by norms, which are, after all, not what a norm is, not what I think it's good to do. Norm is what I perceive other people to believe is the right kind of behavior. Norms are extremely powerful, and they are also maybe surprisingly flexible. They can change in favorable and unfavorable directions pretty quickly. So it seems to me a big challenge for people who do research and who worry generally about human behavior, including on the internet, like me, is to find harmless ways of nudging people toward better behavior and away from bad behavior, or ways of making particular content less harmful, for example, by educating people to recognize it for what it is, or to see the malevolent intent behind it.
So,
and as Kate points out, these are not responsibilities of the companies. In my view, the greatest responsibility of the companies regarding this point that I just made is to grant access to serious, rigorous researchers under conditions that are ethical, responsible, transparent, and that allow for open publication, so that other researchers can attempt to replicate results and come up with better ideas for better studies. After all, that's how we solve major human problems related to human behavior. And by the way, also related to technology. Cars are an interesting example. Cars were tremendously good. Cars were used, of course, unintentionally to kill a gigantic number of people in the early years after they were introduced, a time when there were no driver's licenses, there were no traffic lights, there were no speed limits, there were no seat belts, obviously no airbags. I list all of those just to point out that, once again, there isn't one solution. There were a variety of different solutions that had to be carried out by a variety of different actors to decrease the number of injuries and deaths brought about by people driving cars, which, by the way, also when they were first introduced, just like the internet, were a really exciting, spiffy new tool used by a very small proportion of the total population. And then cars, like the internet, very, very quickly became widely introduced before all of these safety measures were invented and eventually made requirements.
I think we're in general agreement on the need for the companies to disclose. The process, I think, will be pretty tricky. I started out thinking that it was their responsibility, and that they would, as a business decision, decide to make themselves safer. I was extremely disappointed with their response to early attempts at studying it. We actually withdrew from a funding group that attempted to do that when they just simply didn't come through with it. So I end up agreeing with Kate's piece in the New York Times the other day, where one of the things she talks about is requiring laws demanding transparency from the platforms. I'm not sure how you exactly do that. I didn't think the government, because of bureaucracy and because of politics, would move fast enough to keep up with the technology. So I don't think simply putting it on government or writing a law today for something that will be operating 5 or 6 years from now in a world we don't even imagine yet is going to be effective. It has to be, I think, some kind of combination. This is a wonderful moment, though, because we're still new in the technology. We're still new in the impact of the technology on media, on the society. So it's at least at Knight Foundation, we made a decision 3 years ago to go reasonably heavily into the funding of research, and it has been actually, I think one of the best decisions we've made is to do that. It'll be governed politically ultimately, but in this seminal moment, I think we have the opportunity to study it disinterestedly, as Susan just suggested, and possibly affect the direction for the common good. I don't remember who talked about all kinds of new kinds of interventions and solutions, and that's a whole lot easier to say than do, which is why we're funding very, very broadly. As I look at it as an old line free speech advocate from the days of what Kate just called old news, you just put 3 more gray hairs on my head. I'm concerned that same Ipsos Knight Foundation study that I told you is just about to be published shows a really rather extraordinary decline in citizen regard for free speech. It's 96 to 84 from 2019 to 2021. In just a handful, a couple of years, to drop from it's still 84. That's a huge landslide number. To go from 96% to 84% is this considered extremely or very important to the democracy. That's a serious drop. It's a serious drop to go from 91 to 73, that an inclusive society and welcoming of diverse groups is a good thing. 91 to 73%. Yes, that's still 73% in support, but it goes down from 91 only a couple of years ago. So I read this stuff and I get very nervous, a sense of real urgency about getting to this. And it's very frustrating to hear the politicization of it, and just as frustrating to hear the cynical, I think cynical withholding of information from the part of the corporations who have the information. I don't think they are going to be any more capable of doing this in the public interest, capital P, capital I, than a newspaper business would have been capable of doing it and examining itself, or any other enterprise, which is why you have independent scholarship and why you have the kind of examination that I think we ought to have of the basic data.
Well, I'm certainly in favor of the expanding role of independent scholars. That may be self-serving, but I'm guessing that on this panel, I'm not going to get any disagreement. Let me turn us, though, to the inner workings of the platforms and this idea of content moderation, which again, and I think Kate's going to yell at me because I'm going to mouth a platitude about trying to fix content moderation. But I guess what I'm wondering, and Kate, especially given your ethnographic examination of the Facebook Supreme Court, you've seen some of this, at least on the inside. What is it that a platform can do to be effective, whatever that means, for content moderation, without going to the point of becoming the arbiters of all truth and becoming almost like a private censor? Is it possible to thread that needle? Is it desirable?
No, I mean, I think that's a great question. Content moderation varies very much on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to yell at anyone, by the way. I was just there.
You didn't. I'm teasing.
But no, I think that there's content moderation varies very much by the platform. So first of all, it depends on the values of the platform itself, the size, who it's trying to serve. Facebook is by far the largest, hosts the most types of mediums is more or less a walled garden. Like, it's not like Twitter, which is just kind of the majority of people are there in a public capacity speaking publicly. Most people on Facebook speak to their friends or to people in their groups that they select into. And those types of things change the nature of the program. And it's different than YouTube, which has a very, very difficult time doing content moderation on hundreds of millions of hours of video and audio that are uploaded like by the minute to its web service. And so like, I think that all of that is kind of to say that there is no one content moderation problem. And also content moderation is something that we've done for forever. It is the move of taking information and turning it into knowledge that was traditionally was a gatekeeping role that intellectuals and scholars and academics played, but also journalists and scientists and professionals. And all of these things are part of what we've lost in the friction. It's not a lie to say that this wasn't a hugely democratizing opportunity to take the many and send it to many. It's amazing now that like I can put something onto my Twitter feed, and if the right person picks it up, it can amplify and have accessibility. And it means one thing if you agree with what the message is, and it means another thing if you don't agree with what the message is, and it means another thing if you think that like the message is harmful to the public at large, and it means another thing if you think the message is one that the public absolutely needs to hear. And all of those lines, as like Susan has said, there is no such thing as bad content. It's no such thing as good content. This is just like according to who. And there are never going to be arbiters of truth. And so one of the things that I guess when I say we've gone through so many phases, I do so many like talks and panels about this stuff because I just think it's so important to increase kind of public understanding of this. And I think we're in this huge like norm solidifying point of inflection over the last like 10 years about what we want to think these platforms are. And the more we move that forward and the faster, the better. But we went through a big phase right before the election in the US around mis and disinformation about the arbiters of truth, and you'll remember the taking down of the Hunter Biden story that was coming out beforehand. Like, was that placed by, like, was that information true? Did it like increasingly looks like it was true? That was all stuff that happened. The New York Post was not wrong. Was it given to the New York Post by Russian spies, like specifically to disrupt the US election? Perhaps. But like all of these things are like, those are things, do we want? Like what you heard at that point was platforms have to take this story down. They cannot amplify this. Fox News can't amplify this. Stop amplifying this. Like all of these sites have to stop amplifying this story that is meant, this true story that is meant, but manipulated story that is meant to kind of, these are all such fine lines. And at the end of the day, now the kind of, at least what I have understood is that people are like, I can't believe that we asked the platforms to take that story down. And I'm like, and I think that this is like, why would we have ever thought that there's no structure for measuring truth or gatekeeping at these companies? It is nascent, it is broken, it is prioritizing the wrong things in many ways. We've seen that over and over again. So to me, it seems like I get the impulse to say, yes, you're like a tobacco company. Let's like hold you responsible because you're the closest, biggest thing that we can point our finger at. But it's at the end of the day, is just this collective failure. And if we kind of think through some of these things that we call for just a few minutes, like I really do think like we can get to some better and less knee-jerk solutions around some of these things that aren't kind of based around kind of the arbiters of truth talking point or these false kind of narratives that are being put out there as like, okay, it's going to be this or it's going to be this. And so that's just one example of kind of where I think that we're, but I do think but plus that we're getting more sophisticated about it. I do think that like, I think like I've been in this conversation now a lot, and like, it's getting better. I wonder if other people think that it is. I have moments where I think it's not, and I get really depressed. But then it kind of is like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, kind of thing. But I feel like we're in maybe a 2 steps forward moment, and it's buoying.
I think it is getting better by the fact that more and more people are using it in more and more sophisticated ways and will evolve. That's one of the reasons why I think this is a really critical moment to do serious scholarship. Now, I'm surprised you wouldn't. I'm not sure that amplification is all of the discussion. It seems to me that there is also responsibility. There have always been gatekeepers. We didn't even mention government and religion along the way. Talk about gatekeepers. We've had in the United States, we've had the private gatekeepers of the various media companies. Now we have the platforms. The difference is the platforms have no liability in terms they have no responsibility in the same sense as a publisher. If you reviewed Section 230, we revised Section 230 to create liability, is it a structure to say that the market will cause a response? Yes, their legal bills are going to go up. Yes, all of those graduates of Villanova Law School will have full employment forever. But that was a market mechanism that kept publishers in tow for a very long time. I'm not sure that's the right solution, but that I think is part of a discussion that says you don't want to be a publisher, but this isn't work. This is leading us down some very dangerous paths, as the data that I shared with you from this new Ipsos Night poll suggests. And I think we need to consider what would be the consequences of letting the market lash back.
Any takers on that? What might be the consequence if we go down that road?
The Section 230 road?
Yes,
reforming Section 230, Alberto? Mm-hmm. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm just throwing it in as one of the things that one could consider. There is no liability. There's no reason. Commercial thinking as the head of a corporation, I don't have the same kind of worry that the head of a television station or radio station or newspaper would have, magazine would have, because I just don't have the same liability. If I did have the liability, I think this would rise significantly. Maybe it's not the same. Maybe we don't end up with the same kind of product liability sort of way of thinking about this. But isn't there some reason to say a policy that was devised to help a new industry, now that new industry controls the world of communication, shouldn't there be some modification? How would you apply it? What would be the standard? What would be the new standard? What would be the law of libel?
I'd be glad to jump in.
I have thoughts, but let Susan go. Sorry.
I like what Frances Haugen proposed, and of course she's not the only one to propose this. When the senators asked her, the platforms, as they have been pointing out for years, do not produce the content. The rest of us do, but they do produce the newsfeed algorithm. And in many ways, that's their product. It's like the billboards or the advertisements that convince people to smoke cigarettes or to drink alcohol, compared with the cigarettes and the alcohol. There was recently an extraordinary study reported in the MIT Technology Review, pointing out that of the top right-wing Christian Facebook pages, first of all, they were created abroad and are maintained from abroad, which of course is one very familiar issue. But to me, the most striking one reported in that piece is that the enormous majority of Facebook users who were reading that content had not searched for and found those pages. They had not sought them out. Instead, they discovered them because they were effectively fed them by Facebook's algorithm. That is an enormous amount of power that the companies are discharging. In my view, not very differently from the way a publisher does, precisely because as we used to contemplate in newsrooms, including that of the Miami Herald, also some others, of course, where I work. One of the biggest decisions you make as a journalist, as a reporter, or as an editor is not even how you write something, but what you're going to write about. Defining the story was absolutely critical. And when Alberto said that we reporters had a lot of power, I smiled, of course, because back then it didn't seem like we had so much power. But now in retrospect, I do see it. And it's that function. It's deciding what the story is. That is what the algorithms now do. And it's a very fascinating, complex problem to ask how one would audit an algorithm, how you could have oversight regarding newsfeed, regarding algorithms. It's not impossible, and I think that is vital. So if platforms were to be given some form of legal responsibility for that, in some way that wouldn't cause other damage, other harms, which again is not at all a trivial question, I think that would really be interesting, at least to explore.
We're not even talking yet about how you would use artificial intelligence to do this at scale.
The algorithms are a form of artificial intelligence. Right. And of course, the computer scientists like to say, AI is neutral. It doesn't have any biases, but of course it does indeed have the biases. Yes. That are baked into it by the people who design it, and then also by the users.
Even algorithms have parents, and they give their child their values. I agree. That's why it's going to be such an interesting question.
And I would just throw in there, it's not just that Facebook Designs is the author of its news feed, and that it brings content to people you wouldn't otherwise hear from. Facebook moderates social relationships. It decides who speaks to whom, who's interacting with whom, which strangers you hear from, people you don't know, as well as how often you hear from people you do know. And so I would say I would just push to think more beyond just content moderation. I think content moderation is super important for this discussion, but it's also the architecture and design of the platforms themselves. I wouldn't go so far as some of the panelists have gone earlier in saying, I would not absolve the platforms of responsibility. I would say it's a shared responsibility between platforms and their users, in the sense that absolutely the design of Facebook shapes how people interact with each other and with whom they interact. The speed of interactions, it's optimized for engagement, for profit. And none of that should be surprising, right? So all of that we've understood for a long time, but it's not engagement like meaningful, deliberative engagement of the sort you might aspire to when you're talking about a democratic polity. No, it's engagement in a shallow Orwellian sense of clicking, sharing, anything that will keep you glued in a superficial way to the screen. And so, I think the kinds of realistic regulatory interventions that might make sense, although they require empirical research and more study to actually fine-tune and design them, are ones that focus on the architecture and design of the platforms, and that get us to revisit the accepted truths. Yes, the toothpaste out of the tube in a sense, but there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't question whether global instantaneous interconnection is necessary, right? We might induce friction into the speech environment, not to stop communications, but to slow them down and encourage people to deliberate about what they say and with whom they speak. And so one example might be, this is sort of a time, place, and manner restriction that's focused on the architecture. So imagine that you've got the speed of delivery is contingent on geographic distance, or let's say social graphic distance, right? So I can communicate within my social graph, my close social ties immediately. But when I'm communicating with people who are further away on my social graph, maybe the speed of communication doesn't need to be as fast as possible with as much reach and influence as possible. Maybe you need to slow that down. Now, I'm not saying these are like what this looks like in practice is difficult to figure out, but no one's focusing on these other alternative kinds of it. Maybe some people are. Some people are talking about in terms of like friction by design and in the privacy context, a little bit on the platform design. But I think in terms of thinking about this big tech regulation debate and what it means for democracy, these are kind of the angles, some of the new angles we should be taking. I just wanted to throw that in there before we wrapped up.
I think that a lot of people have been talking about friction. I mean, I just want to say, like, this has definitely been part of, like, and the nature of the like. I also just want to point out that, like, the nature of what the platform does, as I said before, the very nature of what the platform does and how it's built and what it gives to people changes exactly how the social meaning of all the interactions that happen there in the language. It makes it possible for you to wear a certain color t-shirt and to be a gang symbol, or it makes it possible for you to hit a like button and give someone an eating disorder. Like, I'm being a little like, kind of like, but I'm trying to basically say that, like, these are things that we provide. If it is a text-based medium, your power of your t-shirt goes away. If you take away the like button, the power of your like goes away. These are like architectural restraints, and you're completely correct. It's just like getting boringly back to the really, like, we can talk about, there could be like we could do like an 8-day retreat somewhere about how to build friction into these platforms.
Maybe we will. That's a good idea.
But like, I mean, I'm serious. I've like thought about it.
Put it together and call me. I might be interested.
Yeah, maybe we'll, like, if you pick the place, Alberto, I have faith in you that you'll, like, even Miami sounds fine. It's about to be winter here. I know, like, but I really do wanted to say about Section 230, as long as we're just really just to like bring it home to something concrete. So the idea of kind of a torts-based reform for Section 230 and the liability and bringing libel back into the conversation. I mean, you're completely correct. It did, Alberta. I think there is room for Section 230 reform without breaking the internet. I absolutely think that's true. But I think it's going to do much less than we imagined at this point. And one of the things, like, Susan has brought up, and I've heard it a lot recently, kind of this kind of consumer products idea of like comparing the internet to cars, which I like more and more, just because there was this influx, there was this outrage at cars, there was a lot of harms that cars caused. I was just like, we just repaved like this giant road outside my apartment building in New York City, and just like the amount of architecture and machinery around paving a road had to be developed, like chemical, like engineers made asphalt, and like all of these things that you don't even think about when you're building a combustion engine with wheels. So like, I guess I'm just like, my point is that there are all of these types of externalities that flow out from these things. One of the things that tort law did for this was it created a feedback loop of the least cost provider being the ways that who is the best place to put in place safety mechanisms and what should those safety mechanisms be. And Section 230 has, in a lot of ways, blocked that from happening. In part because it wasn't kind of direct physical harms or property harms that you were causing. And like, they were harms that are harder to measure because they're speech, and the harms are both taking down speech and keeping speech up. And so it's really hard to like balance. But I think that we could go and like kind of revise our notion of what it is that we want from Section 230, what it could give us from that historic perspective, kind of in light of everything that we've been talking about now. And I think that there is a lot of potential there. So just to
Can I ask you a question about Section 230 then? Like an idea? So would you prefer, like when you think about reforming Section 230, do you think in terms of surgical slices, kind of like the sexual exploitation modification to Section 230.
I hated the sexual exploitation modification, but yeah.
I thought that would be so there's like this, like we're going to define exceptional categories. We're going to create the possibility of liability, or do you think it's more of a broad, complete reworking, or just about, get rid of Section 230 and build exceptions from the other way around?
I wouldn't want to get into, you can say this kind of thing and you can't say that. You can deal with this subject and not that subject. The reason I like liability is that it lets juries decide. It lets the market decide. It provides signals. It provides a way for the market to say, sorry, that's just way out of line. And at some point, that will have an impact, because most of Facebook's money and most of Facebook's audience is in a country where that's the way we settle things, through that kind of intervention. I thought there was an interesting pop-up here in the chat. We haven't even touched on antitrust. Well, since we're over already, I suppose this is a hell of a time to bring it up. But there is an argument. There is the Teddy Roosevelt argument. It's just too damn big to not be controlled by the people in any kind of an organized way. I don't know what that.
Let's put it this way: antitrust is likely to be a necessary but insufficient.
Couldn't agree more.
Piece of the solution set.
And it's not by breaking it up. I think it's by other types of mechanisms. But sorry.
Maybe.
And Kate has a great forthcoming article that talks about those things. I hate to do it because really now we're on a roll and could go for another 2 hours, perhaps even 8 days. But I do have to bring this to an end and express my sincere thanks to all of our panelists. And I am going to indirectly give Kate the last word, because I was going to make this a question and we ran out of time. But I was really taken by one of her tweets from just last week that I think in many ways kind of ties everything together. And she wrote, "You cannot predict all possible outcomes that come from new technology, and you certainly can't predict all possible outcomes from connecting the world. But we can be better and more thoughtful in our next actions and their potential outcomes than the ones that got us here." So I think that says a lot and reflects a lot of what we've talked about in our discussion today. So thank you all for coming. Many thanks to the panelists, and we'll see you next time.